Hello, everyone. I am Alicia Cheek from NCDA headquarters. On behalf of the National Career Development Association, welcome to NCDA's webinar series. We are pleased that you've joined us today. Before we get started, I wanted to share some technical information with you. During the webinar, all attendees' microphones will be muted. We encourage any questions to be typed into the chat section, which can be found on the lower section of your screen. Please use the chat section and not the Q&A. It's just easier for myself and our presenters to manage and see those questions coming through when you use the chat feature. Our presenters will address those questions at the end of the presentation. Individuals who have signed up for this webinar can log in to their accounts on the NCDA website to view their CE certificates and transcripts beginning next week. Groups that are attending will need to return their sign-in sheets to me in order to receive their certificates. This webinar is approved for 1 hour of continuing education. For any questions, you can contact me. My contact information was included in your webinar instructions message. We now present Ethics in a Pandemic, What to Keep in Mind.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're really excited that we're able to spend an hour kind of really working on refreshing our ethical development and growing within our ethical development profession. I really just want to reiterate that ethical development is not a light switch, it's a process. And so we wanted to offer something topical in terms of what we have been dealing with for over a year now, in terms of the ethics and the pandemic, kind of how it has impacted events that have been happening for us. So my name is Azra Karajic Siwiec, and I am a contributing professor for Walden University. I have been a practicing counselor educator for the last 13 years. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sarah Patterson Mills, and I am Assistant Dean of Human Services at Lindenwood University, and have been practicing as a counselor for, oh my goodness, almost 20 years now.
Hi, my name is Amanda Chenkin, and I am the career counselor at Front Range Community College in Fort Collins, Colorado. I've been a practicing counselor for 5 years now.
And hi, I'm Stacy Van Horn. I'm excited to be here. I'm a faculty at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. I have been a counselor educator for about 14 years and school counselor for 10 years before that. So welcome.
We're all members of the NCDA Ethics Committee, and we really wanted to kind of share what we aim to cover today. Really focus on the everyday practice in terms of reflecting on the norms that have changed for us and the way that we used to do work to the way that we do work now. Even the delivery of this event is done in an electronic format or within our own homes as we're really trying to attend to the change of landscape due to COVID. So we're focusing on addressing the ethical values, ethical best practices, and then how do these relate to the aspects of wellness, supervision and consultation, the idea of virtual world, and then the workplace norms. As we're aiming to do this, we wanted to say that as ethics committee members, we want to refresh folks' memory in terms of what we do. We are currently in the process of editing our NCDA Code of Ethics. We are looking for more members who want to join the NCDA Ethics Committee, and we also serve the public. If any members have, if any NCDA members have any questions for us from the idea of ethical inquiry, we're happy to answer those anonymously. We also are providing different levels of training, such as this one, whether doing presentations at the NCDA conference or doing this. And then the final one that we also do is our Ethics in a Nutshell. And Sarah Patterson is our editor for the Ethics in a Nutshell. So we constantly are trying to provide different learning platforms of learning environments for our members. So and by the way, we're still looking for members. So if anybody wants to join or thinks that they're interested in joining NCDA Ethics Committee, please either reach out to me or Sarah. We are the co-chairs. So switching gears, we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to touch up a little bit on theory in terms of what is it, refresh our memory in terms of philosophical literature. We're going to talk about Kitchener's 5 principles. So there were Kitchener's 5 principles that were developed in 1984 and then revised in 2000. And then we have the Bouchon and Childress and Cohen who developed the concept of veracity as a something that folks should strive towards. So the first one that we have is the concept of autonomy. Obviously, these are the things that we are quite familiar with, so we're just going to spend a little bit of time reviewing them, and then we're going to move on into deeper discussion. The first one, the concept of autonomy, that's very familiar and important in, oh, I'm sorry, Amanda, you can't see me forwarding the slides?
No,
Yeah,
we
the
can't
slides
see
don't
it.
look like
Can't
they're
see
forwarded.
it.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I was moving in.
Now it is.
No, we
Okay.
do.
Okay. Kitchener's 5+1, with the first concept being autonomy. Have you seen me switch the slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Promotion of self-determination, the freedom of clients to choose their own direction. It's a concept that's very familiar for the Western society and something that we very much want to emphasize. We really wanted to respect the cultural values within the Western society and give our clients ability to manage the course of their life. We never want to promote dependence with our clients. We always want to give them control to choose how to promote their own self-determination and lead their self-determination. Non-maleficence, I think even as we talk about throughout the remainder of this presentation, we're going to talk about avoiding doing harm. Non-maleficence, the concept is very much the basic of trying to refrain to do harm to our clients in public. And so that's a big one that we're constantly going to have to keep in mind. The next one is beneficence, promoting good for others. NAFSA contributes to the growth and development of clients within their own cultural concept. We want to understand how our client wants to grow and promote growth for them within their own unique lens of growth. The next one that we have is justice. Justice is focused on being fair, giving equally, but always keeping in mind the concept of equity, as opposed to giving equally to everybody, really keeping in mind the concept of equity and understanding where our clients are coming from. And the last two that we have are fidelity, promises that are made or kept, fulfilling one's responsibilities in the relationship. So I think even as we talk about virtual world, we're going to talk about the whole idea of fidelity, but then recognizing how fidelity applies in this virtual world setting when we're sharing a space with other people. And so how do we maintain confidentiality, for example? So how do we keep our clients believing that their trust is still being respected and we're maintaining confidentiality? And then the last one that we have that is not a Kitchener principle, but is more developed later in 2000s is the concept of truthfulness, accuracy, honesty, overall integrity. And it's coming from virtue ethics, believing in giving virtue or truthfulness to our clients, or really maintaining what we say we're going to maintain. So not just taking an ethics class and saying, yes, I'll do those things, and then acting after you graduate, acting a different way, truly maintaining ethical development throughout your life. So very, very much a virtue concept. So as we're talking about ethics in the pandemic times, we're talking about our world being so different, so strange. Our script for living our life, our script of doing things, our normalcy, our own autonomy and control is consistently being, in a way, moved and changed and stepped on. So we wanted to address these pandemic topics. So the virtual work and the interactions in the K-12, as well as in higher ed, wellness, boundaries, staying healthy, supervision and consultation, workforce of the future, the impact of today on tomorrow's life. So as members of the committee, we will share these topics and we will include you in the conversation. We are monitoring the chat, and so we should be able to see your questions. So we will monitor the chat and bring in your questions. So if you have any questions for us or you want to share with us anything, please let us know. We do want to ask a question of all of the members that are attending. What area do you represent? Is it higher ed? Is it what constituency group of NCDA do you represent? If you can send that in the chat at this point, that would be wonderful. Kelly says she's in private practice.
I don't know that the chat opens up for everybody, but if you hover over the chat in the bottom right, it should open up the little bubble if you want to tell us where you're working.
So I'm going to allow folks to really speak and connect with us as we're trying to hear what area, what constituency do you represent, but we wanted to move with the topic as we're talking about, I have the right side, virtual work and interactions. We're talking about higher ed. We're talking about areas of, we're talking about how much has K-12 changed in the last year and a half. We're talking about how much our setup of how we educate students has changed. And then we're talking about the concept of how higher ed has changed for us. I have been homeschooling my kids for this whole year. And so the environment and kind of the picture says it all. Everybody's stuck to their computers. My 10-year-old just told me the other day, he said, I can't take this anymore. My brain hurts. Literally, my brain hurts. And these are the things, this is the burnout that we're talking about in terms of higher ed. We are talking about folks who used to teach 130 folks in the classroom setting. Now they're teaching them in a virtual setting, 10 in the classroom, 20 in a virtual setting, and kind of monitoring the conversations. Other thoughts or examples from the members?
Yeah, I would say what you're mentioning, Azra, is that disconnect, that connection and linking when we think of, working in higher ed, connecting to students, even colleagues, haven't seen colleagues in a year if you're not going into the office and yeah, through Zoom meetings. But the whole idea, we've had some doctoral students and master's students that mention they really miss just walking by your office, because that's where those, organic conversations come up. That's where discussions come up, really interesting ideas, and also just to getting to know each other outside of the classroom setting. And haven't had that in over a year. I know for our students, that's something that's come up, and also for faculty not having those bonding connections that just in the hallway and going in each other's offices. I think that is part of that when we think about interactions, and those are being limited.
Yeah, I think there's a pervasive uncertainty that exists, when you're in person trying to explain something or build a relationship, there is a difference. There is a dimension in my mind lost than when you're in person. So we had 2 faculty members start in the pandemic, actually no, 3. And so one of them has never been to campus. So things like that, when you said disconnect, really resonate, because even though we talk about how we can be connected through these platforms, there's still that loss of human connection that is not happening. So
Certainly. And go ahead. Sorry. I was going to read in chat.
It's, I think it adds to the complexity because many of us, myself included, really prefer the in-person aspect. And I've learned over the last year that for colleagues and students that I work with, they have found connection in the remote world. And so as we're moving forward, like, how are we balancing, or how are we integrating all of these ways? Because for some people, they have found that this time is indeed better for them. And so that's something I've reflected on a lot as we've talked about this, particularly through kind of an ethical lens.
So we recognize that in our virtual world, we have, we're talking about Zooming, and Zoom fatigue is definitely present. We're recognizing that we're working, here I am working right now, and my kiddos are upstairs and they're doing their schoolwork. They are in classrooms at this time. Kelly says she gets tired of Zoom and Skype by the end of the day, and the attention span really goes out the window by Friday. But that's the idea, that we're all, our brains are not wired to do this type of work. And so there is that lack of connection, the way we do our work changed. I know last year when COVID just hit, I used to teach in a 4-hour increment, and then had to translate that to 4 hours of Zoom, and it just was not the same. And so we had to figure out, how do we truly, it's this whole translation process. How do you translate that from one culture to another culture? Because this is a completely different culture. It's as somebody who's not native, who's had to do that cultural transition, this truly is a cultural transition. And so as we're thinking about ethics, and what are the issues that are really affecting folks? I know I've heard of somebody who has shared that they were doing counseling online, and somebody walked by in their space, or somebody opened the door in their office, and the client felt that concept of veracity and fidelity was being violated because somebody else was privy to the information. So these are the types of things that are happening for us, because we've all had to find spaces where we can practice, where we can do our work, and how do we maintain, not only how do we maintain that Zoom, lower that Zoom fatigue so it doesn't occur as frequently, how do we maintain ethical practice? How do we remain ethical? So what are you thinking are the best practices in this virtual world and interactions, or in the world of K through 12?
Just looking at that picture, I was smiling as you're talking, because that picture encapsulates and kind of captures what you're all saying. But I would say one thing is that confidentiality piece you mentioned, Azra, in terms of, is there an availability of a private space where someone can be vulnerable and really open up and share? And that would be for students with anxiety and depression, or adults that are getting work with career counseling and direction with that, and practice, maybe interviewing or going over someone's resume, but having that privacy and having that space where they feel safe, where they can be vulnerable and open.
And how does that look too in these different settings? So the first area that we were going to kind of lead into, Stacy, was that K to 12 area. And of course, these things are going to look different in all these settings. But maybe we could talk more about the specific areas and what it looks like, what it feels like.
Mm-hmm. What does it feel like? that's a very interesting thing, because we're talking about, and I've been in that world as a parent where I'm proceeding with, I'm working with one kid, but then I have another child in the room, and kind of how do we keep our voices down so that we can communicate but not disturb the other person, and how do we stay current, how do we fulfill the responsibilities, and if you're doing homeschooling, it's a little bit challenging. How do you do your job, and how do you continue to support your children? How do you continue to do different things? So what are the things that are coming up for you, Sarah, as you're thinking about this in terms of K through 12, that has been the most challenging thing in terms of virtual work and interactions?
I think one of the things we just talked about right before our conversation here, two of us have seniors in high school. And of course, they're a little bit more fortunate this year because they have been able to do some in-person things than the prior year. But there has been, we talk about our Zoom fatigue, and I put a question in the chat, just curious how many Zoom meetings you have a week. But when we're learning that way every day, all day, in these very intensive classes, without any social interaction, right? So developmentally at that age, we're looking at social interaction as being one of their main outlets of support and leisure. And so that's really become, and even for the little elementary kids, I have an elementary kid as well. And so trying to figure out how to balance some socialization, right? Particularly before we opened up, like right now, as things are more opening up. But prior to that, it was a very difficult thing. And so we have these prolonged periods of kids and adults that have been in isolation really for a year. And so developmentally, you wonder, as we're socially wired, how that is impacting wellness and what types of things are counselors going to be dealing with. A lot more of these mental health issues. And so helping to educate ourselves on what we're seeing and helping to educate our families that we're working with and our clients as to how to best re-enter re-enter the workplace and re-enter some of these other places, because there is some anxiety around that, I think. And so that's one set of issues I see happening here.
I would say I agree. And I was just going to share also, because I think Steve here says he's in K through 12, and you're mentioning hybrid or different settings in the class. And I know some of our school counseling supervisors have mentioned how they're really trying to make sure, and we think of ethics as including everyone in the caseload. How do you involve those students that are doing school from home, if there's also students face-to-face, and kind of addressing that, but also through webinars and really creative ways that they've had to kind of think outside the box to connect to parents, families, but to students, and also to colleagues. And how do you address, as you mentioned, Sarah, the anxiety, even depression, the isolation. And so making sure when we think of ethics, are we reaching all of the populations, not just some? And how do we do that? And
the issues that arise from not seeing those students that we really do need to lay eyes on as a counselor, school counselor in particular, that are more vulnerable of our populations because they are minors. So
and do they have access to the technology? So
yeah, and I think that you're speaking to that whole social and cultural lens of how do we make sure that we're attending to everybody, and that some kids are not disappearing from the focal point, because those perhaps there should be more part of our focal point disappear than the kids that have all of the resources at home are the ones that are attending and thriving in the environment, perhaps more so than others. My state has opted to do the standardized testing, and it was just so interesting to see, as the standardized testing was done for the kids, how the elementary school kids had had an option of not showing up to school and not doing standardized testing, so they were going to do something different for them. But then the intermediate, so the fourth graders did not had to show up to school. And so I'm thinking about the concept of autonomy. How much autonomy are we giving our clients to make decisions, to figure out what is best for them in those moments? How much autonomy are we allowing folks, and how much are we promoting good? What do you, in terms of ethical principles, for me, autonomy is a very big principle. We want to keep that in mind. You know, Amanda, we talk about higher education as well with our students. We want to give them autonomy. I know at some point you talked about students not stopping by in these virtual Zoom career sessions. And so how do we track folks along the path of their development and track it and bring them in, but autonomy being a big piece of that? How do we give them the autonomy to exercise this, but also continue to promote beneficence, to promote good?
And also justice. So being from you know, a career center on campus, how are we providing information, resources, and support in an equitable way? I mean, that's always a question, but I think particularly through COVID times, it will be, and beyond, will be something that we have to consider and think about is, are the things we're doing equitable to meet student needs?
Any other ethical principles that we should keep in mind in terms of this virtual world, virtual work and interactions? You know, we definitely emphasize confidentiality, which talks about the whole concept of autonomy and fidelity, really keeping the information. Even when we're thinking about FERPA, in all of these, we have to maintain FERPA. And how do we maintain FERPA if we're in our home environment and somebody, you know, like our kids are using our computers in the morning and we're using it in the afternoon? How do we manage obligations related to FERPA? How do we maintain obligations related to confidentiality?
Agreed.
I think you brought up two really good points, and they came up for me because yeah, my daughter is going off to college next year, and there's an appointment for advising, and it's virtual. And they said, oh, parents can't be there, it's for FERPA. And my daughter immediately, when she hung up, said, oh, I know you can't be there, but I'm going to text you and I want you in the other room to listen in, just because she wants me to be a part of that. But it made me think, yeah, we can't secure or guarantee that virtually. Right. And so even with any kind of distant counseling or telehealth, that comes into play in terms of the ethics and the confidentiality and the boundaries there. But yeah, that's interesting because that just came up the other day and I laughed thinking, but what about that FERPA for clients? Yeah.
You know, and Stacey, thinking about group counseling, it's a similar type of principle. Yeah. I think, you know, we can try and guarantee confidentiality, but as I was a school counselor for a minute there for a while, and it's hard to do that with a group of middle school classes, you know. Yeah. They like to talk. So things come up, and it's one of those things where, again, you can't guarantee confidentiality, but that needs to become part of that front end conversation. So, you know, in terms of supervision, for example, all of that at the front end to be proactive, informed consent, and that becomes part of that. It has to be part of that conversation.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to mention something else, you know, the danger of our clients. You know, our clients will join us through their phones. And so there's this danger of they're driving a vehicle while they're talking to us, or doing, who knows, you know, they're moving about and doing stuff. And so you don't know where you are. You could be in a grocery store having a session, not you personally, but the client is bringing you into the grocery store, and everybody else in the grocery store is privy to that. So there's that. But then, you know, Carrie brought up this whole moving between states, and what are the state regulations? Because folks move, you know, what if client goes to another place, and how do you figure out where your client is? Are they in the grocery store, or are they in a different state, and what rules apply?
Right. Steve also brought up the issue of justice. Amanda, kind of what you were talking about, that idea that, and I'm in rural, we have rural areas in Missouri and Illinois. I'm in St. Louis, but we do have not only in higher ed students who can't get broadband at their houses, which has presented an issue when you're trying to learn counseling skills right in the classroom because you can't see their faces and things. But you have to be able to. So you have to find workarounds. But that idea of justice, when you have some students who don't have access, is certainly an important consideration. I think, Amanda, you had touched on that earlier through that multicultural lens.
Quickly,
Go ahead.
I was just going to share quickly Stacy's story from yesterday of her daughter and like, oh, can you be in the other room? So in the beginning of COVID, I was the counselor in this situation. I had not told the student, no parents, because that's not what I do. However, I was talking with the student, and the whole time the parent was sitting off camera, and I didn't know. So they didn't share with me that parent was in the room, and that made me think, like, so confidentiality,
Sure.
autonomy, that conversation was probably not as good as it could have been. So as you were talking, I just, it kind of is both ways, right? Of asking those questions of who's in the room or who could be in the room walking through.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, so definitely we want to keep our, in terms of our work, we want to consider giving clients autonomy, always emphasize justice and understanding the client's perspective and promoting good, as well as fidelity and veracity, doing what you have to do. As we're moving to the next slide, we're going to focus on wellness.
Yeah, and so I'm going to talk about wellness. One of the things that also, when I think about the virtual and even going to wellness, is even self-compassion. This just kind of hit me because for me, teaching online remote, and I know for school counselors and teachers and private practice and nonprofits, there's so much to learn. And I know I was really hard on myself when students were virtually and I couldn't get something to work, and I felt so bad. And I'm like, oh no, they're just staring and I don't hear anything on the other end because they're all muted. And so for me, I had to really practice self-compassion to be okay that we're all learning this and kind of give that grace to myself. I know it was very easy to give it to my students, but I wasn't giving it to myself. And so that was kind of this learning process for me. And so when we move on to wellness and think of two areas really when we think of wellness is boundaries and maybe staying healthy. And so when I'm thinking of that, and I want to hear from you all, when we think of the boundaries, and often with this pandemic, it's, the boundaries are blurred between work and life and what that's like. And I think, Azra, you kind of talked about that blending together where, preparing the kids' lunch and then running in the other room to get on a meeting, or having a break and all of a sudden someone's crying or upset, or the dog's barking because the lawn's being done in the middle of class, or someone's knocking on the door. Those kinds of things blend it. But also when we think about the interruption of routine. And so having too strict of a routine where we're sitting having that Zoom for 10 hours or sitting there not leaving the computer because one thing blends into the other, or not having any routine and feeling very uncertain about things or discombobulated at times. And so having that structure or no structure can really be, from a lot to a little, and having no breaks or even going outside. And so that kind of blends into the second part of staying healthy. And I know we talked about depression and anxiety and having that challenge mentally and physically for so many. And so I want to kind of hear a little about from the panel and also from us, for the participants, what is that like for you in terms of your mental and physical health and things that you've maybe sacrificed or put on hold, like checkups, things like that, as opposed to things that you are doing or not doing. So I don't know if I can open it up to our panel, and then afterward, I'll connect it a little bit to the Code of Ethics and bring that to play. What are some thoughts?
It's funny, you can be, as an educator or practitioner, you can be working till 9 or so at night, but then depending on what type of job you're at, you may have folks calling you at 8 a.m. the next morning. And now they're not just calling you and leaving a voicemail, they are expecting you to be available for video calls through Microsoft Teams. And so it causes you to put your health aside, I think. You know, and plus we haven't had the physical capacity to even go to some of the gyms for part of this time, or to go even outside without a mask and these types of things. So the actual facilities haven't even been available, but it becomes something that, you know, they talk about work creep. I think it needs to be a little stronger than creep, because it does have you rearrange. I'm constantly rearranging. Oh, I'll go swim later. Oh, I'll go do it tomorrow. Oh, I don't have time today. Oh, this just came up, you know, because I just got this video call or what have you. And so it becomes, that work will be there when you get back. So
Yeah, so not making wellness a priority, kind of, that's the thing that gets sacrificed first.
Yes, exactly. I think that's fair to say.
You know, I've heard a lot of colleagues in higher ed, which higher ed seems to be hard hit at this point. Financial, you know, you hear about financial issues, you hear about higher ed institutions shutting down, and it's really affecting higher ed. Institutions are saying to the faculty, worry about our students, take care of our students, please take care of our students, our students. But there has been like no mention of the faculty. Like, what about me? What about, you know, can we have anything for us, a recognition of any kind? And you know that all of these recognition things that used to happen, the things that you got intrinsic value out of, all went away. And so we really have had to figure out how to survive. I mean, because we do exactly what Sarah says. We do skip consistently and check off, or kind of say, oh, I'll do it next time, or I'll move it to tomorrow. And tomorrow I just have more pressing things. And so somewhere down the line, I'm going to have this self-care 1 hour activity while I do 59 other things that I have now substituted this with. And so the idea is, you know, the boundaries, the thing that you talk about, Stacey, it's important to have healthy boundaries and practice healthy boundaries so that you know when your work day ends, so that you can start, your identity can start, and you can recharge yourself. You know, we talk about the whole concept of battery. You know, on our empty battery, you are not capable of doing anything. Our phone is incapable of functioning with our batteries empty. But I think we need to keep that in mind every time when we're thinking about moving our swimming, 1 hour swimming for the week. We need to keep that in mind, that our empty battery is not going to be very helpful.
And your brain works so much better when you do that. And I tell myself that too, and I still will say, oh, but I need to. So it is a constant mental cognitive restructuring, I think. Because again, the physical boundaries as we know them have disappeared. We're not going to work and then leaving work physically.
Right. It all blends together.
Connected all the time, so becomes.
But we feel like I'm gaining that hour of driving, right? So I should be more productive. I think we go down a wrong rabbit hole because we keep saying we're not driving. I don't have to get dressed, so I have these 1 to 2 hours. Let me tell you, that's that cup of coffee in your drive and listening to the book on tape or book on whatever. I'm dating myself now, but the idea is that is very important to our self-care. All of a sudden, we no longer have this.
It's gone.
And I think
yep.
Terry says that she feels the same pressures, that it's not just higher ed, that workers are burning out in high numbers, and we're seeing how important boundaries really are, that we are quickly losing track of who we are and what we're doing as we're giving in to
all the while that people are losing family members to COVID.
Yes.
We're dealing with grief, and you can't, and it's an unusual grief because you can't even be physically present with the person. You can't be at the hospital. You can't be in the nursing home. People have had a tremendous amount of loss during this time, that it seems like it's kind of in the background, but it's, to me, and even with speaking school counseling, for example, it's going to be common issue, I think, that really surfaces, and probably with our clients and our practices too, as we reemerge back to some sort of standard operating procedure, whatever that is going to be. But
because dealing with that trauma of grief and loss and not having to deal with it, or having the resources, or having to deal with it, but then all of a sudden now we're back to maybe this new normal, but things are not the same.
Things are not normal, right?
They're not normal. They'll never be the same that way. And I'm wondering, I put in there if anyone wanted to share how they were dealing with that wellness and making it a priority, because I think it was mentioned also just the idea of how important it is to move our bodies. As you mentioned, as we're just getting in the car, listening to music, or talking to a friend, or walking across campus, or whatever that is, those daily errands and running around, that was your body moving, even if it wasn't set as exercise. And so that is part of it, and realizing aches and pains for wellness, and also mentally. As we mentioned. And if I'm connecting it back to the NCDA Code of Ethics, I found when we look at Section C, professional responsibility, there's an interesting quote in the introduction. It's on page 9 of that. It's career professionals engage in self-care activities to maintain and promote their emotional, physical, mental, and spiritual well-being to best meet their professional responsibilities. So if we take all that in and we think of wellness and how that's connected to being the responsibility of a professional, and even diving in a little more, professional competence, and that's standard C, which monitoring effectiveness. So are we continually seeking supervision, consultation, and being a reflective practitioner? Are we looking at our own selves and that self-awareness, and how are we caring? How are we doing our jobs, and how are we helping others? And then the other part is impairment, and that's being alert to the signs of impairment. Our own impairment, and also of colleagues and those we work with. It's really important that we're kind of looking at that. And so when we think about supervision and consultation and looking at professional responsibility, it kind of comes together when we think of the Code of Ethics and wellness.
Yeah, so I agree. And I think I'll share, because I don't think I'm alone in this, is that for lots of us, this last year was purely survival, right? Like for me, all systems went down, and basically, the more I reflect on the last year, it's been survival. And how I survived was just working all the time. So I work in higher education. I also have a private practice, and I took on a lot of clients because I didn't have anything else to do. Probably not a healthy choice. And as I recognize that, I'm not accepting new clients. Like, there are lots of boundaries that I'm starting to put back in place to get back to being healthy. But I think I don't know, I feel like it's safe to say everyone went into some sort of survival mode. And we're all going to have to figure out what that looks like moving forward, because some things did work for us, maybe that we want to keep. And there are definitely things that we have to reevaluate. So thought I'd share that as well.
Yeah, and Amanda, Carrie mentioned, taking the walk an hour a day to break up the computer time, stepping away from the computer is so important, and also saying no and having those boundaries, not to say yes to everything. There are some things you need to not,
And my colleagues have talked about the uptick in their client loads because of the pandemic, partly because of the increased mental health issues. And so, being helpers by nature, we want to continue to schedule. We don't want to turn somebody away that because we're helpers. And so again, Amanda, I can understand or relate to what you're saying, because we want to help, but there has to be a limit to what we can physically do ourselves as well. But the uptick in people needing services is amazing. And we was it Carrie that was talking about her work? And I can imagine the client population that you're working with has increased quite a bit over the last year. And so how do you walk that tightrope is the question.
As,
yeah, it seems like Kelly.
Go ahead, Amanda.
I was just going to point out that it looks like Kelly has had a similar experience with taking on too many clients and trying to step back from that a little bit. And I agree, the platform pressure is tremendous. I'm on a couple of platforms that I've turned off accepting new clients for that.
Yeah, and Amanda, you mentioned this concept of survival. I mean, our future looked super bleak. We didn't know when the end was going to come, and we didn't know what was going to look like. So we said, well, we might as well accept more clients because, hey, I'm not doing anything. I'm not going anywhere. And I don't, I better make a living because it's like life is on, the concept of how life looks like is so different. So I might as well do something with my time. And I think, there's this idea that Sarah mentioned, we want to help, but then there's also this concept of, well, I might as well because I have nothing else to do. And I think that's the part that really played into our, I'm no longer driving, so I cut out an hour of drive or whatever it is. So we were doing these cognitive plays in our head, kind of allowing for that. So it got us there. And so now it's very important to stand up to figure out what our fine line is and what's important, because our battery being charged is the most essential thing. And so as Stacy has said, we have to keep in mind that it can lead to impairment, and once we are impaired, we cannot perform. And so it's important for us not to get to impairment. So when our battery is discharged, it truly exemplifies that idea of impairment. And so we have to continue to say no and find the time. I'm going to move us to supervision and consultation, and then we're also need to allow time for the last slide.
I think you've really led us nicely into supervision and consultation, and Stacy as well, because it's kind of a trickle down concept, right? If we're doing too much and we're supervising students or practitioners who are learning the field, we have to emulate what we want to see. And certainly we have the drive to help and all these other things as supervisors, but we can't do more than what we can do. And so emulating that and really modeling that for boundaries for our supervisees is super important. And the other thing that came up earlier that I think is also important, because we are trying to keep our heads above water, where do you have time to be reflective? That is so understated in all settings, really. As a school counselor, what's working in my program? What's not working? When do you have time to do this if you're putting out fires? If you're in higher ed, it's, when do I have time to see, is this assignment working? Is this curriculum working? Do I need to change or tweak something to be more consistent with today's times? Where do we need the pivots? And so that reflective time has really disappeared, I feel, which puts us ethically in a compromising situation when we're trying to be supervisors and oversee things, gatekeepers, so to speak, right? So it becomes very difficult when you don't have that time, like we probably had in the car before with their cup of coffee. We don't have that as much anymore, and it's a problem. It puts us in compromising positions, I think.
Yeah, and if we're thinking of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I want us to consider, we can successfully progress and grow only once our basic needs are met. And so if you're working with a supervisee who is focused on surviving and focused on managing day to day, they're not really focused on this reflective piece. And so whether you are the most reflective supervisor, to promote that is very difficult. And I'm thinking about all of these supervisees who are now in school. Some of them are mine, who are in school settings and are figuring out how to do different things. I had to do a different training thing for a student of mine who was trying to introduce wellness model to the parents because they were really trying to figure out how to help them figure out their boundaries and what wellness implies for parents and how to do the same for kids. I think we have to keep going back to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs and prioritizing our health and survival. And so we can't, as supervisees, we cannot understand or focus too much on growth because we're stuck somewhere in an earlier phase of development.
Exactly.
I'm going to move us. Sarah, did you have anything else? Because I wanted to give time.
The only other thing that I wanted to mention is I think that there's a bit of a slippery slope because we are trying to stay heads above water, that, you know, paying more attention to things like when the appointment time starts and stops, not going over that, not taking on too many clients, which we've already talked about, are some ways to at least keep that structure, the integrity of that structure, and some of those physical boundaries that will help to keep things ethical. That's what I wanted to add.
Yeah, we want to give our supervisees ability to have autonomy to figure out their development.
Absolutely.
Workforce of the future.
So I think, you know, I guess it's a good place to conclude, because all of these things that we talked about today and more are going to continue. Like, I don't think what's happened over the last year, I think there are lots of things that are here to stay, like teleworking and remote or virtually seeing clients and students, and doing virtual workshops and classes, and like hybrid models. And so the ethical points that we've made today, I think will continue. And when I think of like the workforce and how we're moving, in the code of ethics, the area around technology, so I think it's section F, and how we use technology. Are we competent in technology? How are we evolving? And then also keeping in mind, particularly, I think, justice and autonomy, and non-malfeasance for our clients and our students and who we're working with. So I think that kind of like wraps things up in terms of how we're going to have to move forward in keeping all of these in mind, as many of us return to some form of being back in person and working virtually. So I'd love to hear your all's thoughts.
Yeah, I think I'm just thinking like how much more advanced my kiddos are with Zoom, because they're constantly using Zoom for their lessons and stuff, and you know, Movie Max and Edulastic, and then, you know, like they're talking to me about all the stuff, and I'm like, oh wow, I didn't know you can do this in Zoom, you know. But they're like, Mom, look at this, look at that. So they're definitely these kids are now growing up. They're developed. They've seen their parents focus more on the screens. They themselves have spent a whole lot more time. And, you know, like my husband and I used to have this limit of screen time, and then with pandemic went out the window because there was just no way for us to have a screen limit because they were in front of the screen all day. So these are the things that definitely defied our norms. And so I think it's very important for us to recognize autonomy, but recognize also how do we promote good, and recognize, you know, how do parents, if we're talking about school counseling, how do parents reestablish boundaries again, and, you know, work with kids?
How do we avoid harm and do good? You know, because kids are, this is my own opinion, but there's a level of, I don't want to use the word addiction, but the desire to be on an electronic device 24/7, if you have a kid in elementary school, is so difficult right now. Well, even older than that, right? But that is literally all they have known. We had the conversation in the neighborhood this weekend. No, you're not going to go outside and play roadblocks with the neighbor. You're going to go outside and run and swing and talk. And so there's a whole generation, and they've missed a year of school. I know it's been online, But, you know, summer tends to be a time when some content is lost. I really wonder about the next round of assessments when we do pick those standardized assessments back up. Where are our kids falling, and how will that impact the skills they need later to work in the workforce? So these things are ripple effects into the long term, I think.
Yeah.
You know,
And I think,
I was just looking at, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, and what are the soft skills with these kids? You know, what's going to happen with them, you know, years down the road? I'm sorry, Stacy, go ahead.
No, not at all. I was just reading what Keely was saying about, you know, seeing her clients inhabit, you know, as she works with them and seeing them through Zoom. And I think there are some takeaways in terms of things that were more of a connection. I know my students have said that too, in terms of doing online scavenger hunts or some kind of icebreakers when I start a class, or even continuing with online office hours, accessibility for students that don't live near campus or having a hardship where they're working and they can't come. So when we're looking to the future, some changes that have come from this that hopefully can help us connect or have more access. I know with even my husband's position, it was always a go into the office, but now since all of this, they've given choice to, you know, the worker saying, how many of you want to do 2 or 3 days at home, or all days at home, or all days at work? And so there's that flexibility to save space too, but also what is your best work? How do you work best in terms of what you can do? And so I think that kind of played into that. And I think also I see Steve with digital citizenship in terms of skills that are really important, and what the, you know, what are the pitfalls and what are some things, responsibilities that have to do with children, adolescents being on the web and surfing the internet and doing social media, and all of that has been addressed, but now even more so. So I just wanted to mention that.
So I'm going to move us into the question time. I wasn't sure if there were any questions that arose. We really wanted to keep us moving. There's so many issues that have come up, even as we chatted over these over this presentation several times, and we just continued to talk and develop new ideas, and how much would this impact this, and how much has this affected us in this way or the other. So Kelly's keeping true to her clients. Be well, Kelly. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for coming. If you all have final thoughts, what do you find is the most important ethical practice that you feel like you will maintain as a part of this? Sarah, what's something that you're going to maintain just based on what we're talking about?
I am motivated to go to my lap lane today and not push it off again. I think you guys have really helped me. I mean, really, I do. Just even spending some cognitive, intentional time on what is really your priority, which we don't always have time to do, as we've talked about with this virtual world. But that's my takeaway today for sure.
Awesome. Amanda or Stacy?
I think I agree with Sarah in terms of just taking cognitive time to actually reflect and think. And I know for myself that's starting to happen more just because I'm starting to have more space, and the being able to go do more things in a more safely has helped open up cognitive brain space for those things to happen. So, and I'm just paying attention to what's happening in the workforce and how it's changing in general, because organizations and companies have to make some pretty big, they're going to have to continue making really big shifts in what's quote unquote maybe normal or expected.
For me, I think it was just really prioritizing moving. And so even thinking about scheduling in time that I'm actually going outside. You know, I live in Orlando, the weather's beautiful, but I can't tell you how many days where I actually never set foot outside in a row. That's changing as the bubble's opening and things are, you know, kind of increasing in terms of expanding our time outside. But for me, just really scheduling just walks outside, going outside and being in nature, I think is really important for me to schedule. So that's my big takeaway.
Yeah, mine too. So I echo what Stacy said. Thank you all. I really appreciate everybody that has attended. I really appreciate the panelists who have done tremendous work to put this together, and I thank everybody for their time. I'm going to turn it over to Alicia.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our presenters and our attendees for being with us today. Again, if you guys have any questions about continuing education or any of the resources or anything that they've shared today, you can contact me. My email is acheek@ncda.org, and I will send out a follow-up email at the beginning of next week with the link to the recording, as well as information on how to obtain your CD transcript. So thank you, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you all.
Good to see you.
Thank you.